And welcome to a 100huntley.com exclusive. I'm Greg Musselman along with my good friend, Dr. Andrew Blackwood. He is a psychotherapist. And Andrew, we're going to talk about getting our teens and young adults ready for school. And that's a little different, and I've gone kind of through all those phases. So when I think back to my kids when they were first going into, grade school, elementary, preparing them in a certain way. But as they got older, the dynamic changed a lot. So how do we get our young adults and our teenagers ready for school? Because it can be a pretty dangerous place out there for them.
Well, definitely. And like you said, the older they get, sometimes the more complicated it gets. So we want to really focus on how well we know our children who are now becoming young adults. And some things really don't change a whole lot, whereas some things really might. So for the child who had trouble with transitions and seemed a little bit anxious about approaching new things, sometimes that still might be the case. So really having a good understanding of what motivates them and being able to recall some of the transitions that they went through and how they did it and what was so great about it. Those are important things to be able to do, but you might not appreciate those things if you're not kind of thinking back about who this child has been. And on the other hand, when there are significant changes, right, it's important to keep our awareness up of who they are now. So knowing them well, knowing what their motivations are, knowing what their Achilles heel might be. So being aware of those things will help us to help them.
Now I have 4 kids. 2 of them, they like to go to bed. 2 of them, not so much so. Proper rest, though, is essential. So when they're younger, okay, you put them to bed, you have a little more control over them. Right. As they get older, it becomes more difficult because if they don't get their rest, it's going to affect them in their studies.
Definitely. And we know the value of rest probably more than the people who are a little bit younger than us, but we don't want to assume that they can't appreciate it. So we don't want to wait till that last minute right there before they're going off to have this, remember to do this, remember to do that. So we want to pull it back and remember we can start these conversations early, but we can have them ongoing. And part of the benefit that we have as parents and being present in the lives of our kids, even if there is some distance, is that we can be supportive all the way throughout. We want to learn how to come alongside them. You mentioned the word control, and that's the last thing that we want to do. That's the last thing they want us to do, and that's the last thing we want to do for them. But when we partner with them, we can really start talking about, okay, so what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for you? I remember growing up, you would have a hard time waking up in the morning. Do you think that's going to be a challenge? Gives them an opportunity to say yes or no. Well, then you get to invite them. So what will you do to overcome that challenge? So you don't want to spell it out and make sure you have a routine, make sure you do this, because then they might just go out and do the opposite of that.
I was thinking of, my dad, he was from the prairies, and, apparently in the wintertime they walked barefoot to school up 3 miles. And, when I was a kid, and he was only kidding, of course. Right. But I think we have to be careful, though, because different personalities, you have to parent them in a different way.
Exactly. So that comes back to knowing who your child is. And I talk about this a whole lot, whether I'm, doing interviews like this or whether I'm face-to-face with clients. Understanding what moves people, what are their core values, because when we tap into that, we can really harness that motivation. For someone who growth is important for them, as it is for me, then you can come alongside them and say, so what's the growth opportunity here? Or how will you grow in this situation? And that will invite them to say, okay, well, this is an angle that I can hold on to.
So motivating a child, from they're younger, hey, at least you like recess. Right. You might not like math and science right now, but as they get older, how do you motivate them when they're teenagers and maybe even into university?
Mm-hmm. It can be quite difficult depending on the teen or the young adult, because there are phases and sometimes there are personalities that they don't seem to like much of anything. But we don't want to buy into that. It's important to recognize the difference between validating and agreeing. We can validate, this aspect, nobody likes that part of school. And then we can come back to, leaving the question, what's the purpose? Like, what benefit are you hoping to get? Like, why did you register? Now, if we've been the driving force behind the registration and applying, then we're going to really find some challenges there that we will want to hear because it will play itself out. So when we validate, okay, so yeah, I get you don't like that, but what is it that you do look forward to, if there is anything, because there's got to be something.
The whole area of anxiety, that is a huge thing. And more so, I think, when I was a kid and when I talked to, to my kids and their friends and parents of other teens, the stress factor. Is there any way we can help our children and friends of our children to deal with those anxieties? Because it's real.
Definitely. And the fact that you said it's real highlights your awareness, not only that it exists, but there's a level of appreciation for it. One of the things which takes us back to the whole validation thing is when people don't feel supported around things that they feel anxious about, they're less likely to talk about it, less likely to express it. And when we hold all those things in, it makes it worse. So being approachable is one of the most important things that you can do. You don't have to solve it for them, but being ready, being open, listening, right? Keeping your eyes open for that sort of thing is really, really key.
So when you leave elementary school, and we were active parents, we would go to the parent-teacher interviews, and we were more engaged. When they got into high school, that started to change, but there was still some interaction, and our kids went to some really good high schools. But then they get to university. How do we help with some of that, staying connected to our child and being in an environment like in the case of the University of Alberta, where our youngest daughter goes? It's like a city. How do you stay engaged? How do you help them navigate if they've got a professor that they just don't like or they're having difficulty with?
We've been building progressively throughout the lives of our children. So when we have a good understanding of who they are, how they work, what they like, what they don't like, we will be more likely to be involved in those conversations. And if you are involved in those conversations, it's a wonderful opportunity to continue on that partnership. One of the things we can ask, well, is there anything that you want from me? How can I be of help? As much as we want to help, we don't want to take the steering wheel. We don't want to take on that role that we're going to solve that problem for them. So we give them the opportunity to know that we're available and to brainstorm about what it is. So they might say, well, you can just pray for me, you can ask me, you can check in, or you can make some suggestions. At this point, they're virtually adults, and we want to really instill that confidence that we know you can handle this situation. And you got to hold yourself back from jumping in and interfering, but we want to really kind of say, what is it that you want from me at the end of the day?
And we can't underestimate, and this is our last point here, is the importance of prayer. Whether they're 5, 6 going into school, or they're in their master's program, prayer still is so key, right, Andrew?
Definitely, definitely. So there's prayer that you can do when you're apart from them, and depending on the relationship and depending on where they are in their own walk, in their own faith journey, we don't want to just assume that prayer is going to be the most helpful thing explicitly, because they're going into an environment where they may have questions. So we want to present ourselves in a way that we're open to those questions. If you're struggling with your faith, this is a safe place. I'm not going to tell you how to think. I might tell you what I think, but we really want to support them to nurture their own relationship with God.
Dr. Andrew Blackwood, always great advice. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.